chapter 11, the great chapter of faith. We got to verse 13 last week, and by way of review, we'll just do 13. We'll read verse 13 and pick it up right there. So turn there, and we'll start. Hebrews 11:13. Remember all the examples of the patriarchs of faith from the Old Testament up to this point. And now, in verse 13, it says, these all died in faith. That's the way to go. Not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on this earth. Here's our faith challenge. When it looks like God's answer to our prayer is not what we had in mind, we want it now. It's on our timetable. And what we prayed didn't happen exactly the way we prayed it. But God did answer our prayer. And so the challenge is, can we in faith just say, not my will, but thine, O Lord? Your plan is not just better, it's perfect. And your timetable is not just better, it's perfect. And just take heed and pray as he tells us to do. Jesus told us to do in Mark 13:33. We talked about that last week. But just considering what we've learned so far in this study, back to Hebrews 3 and 4, the ancient Hebrews, the wilderness Hebrews, were delivered from their bondage in Egypt, and they weren't happy with God's plan and his timetable. This promised land wasn't coming quick enough, right? And 10 times they tested God and demonstrated their unbelief, and finally God said, "You've rejected me. You don't have faith. You can't enter my rest." And he swore in his wrath, he was angry with them, that they would not enter his rest. And then Hebrews 4:9-11 says this. Paul says in Hebrews 4:9-11, he says, there remains, therefore, a rest for the people of God. For he who has entered his rest, capital H, his rest, has himself also ceased from his works, as God did from his. Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. In other words, God's not going to do what he said. He who promised is not faithful, is what we would say in our mind. And that same example of disobedience that the ancient Hebrews say that, your plan is not just, it didn't work out how I wanted it, but your plan's better. It's not just better, perfect. It's perfect. And then we can enter his rest. So that's that diligent faith that we need to have so we can enter his rest. And that is these examples that we're seeing here in chapter 11. We see by faith, all these Enoch and Abel and Abraham, Sarah. We saw all those in all those examples up to now. And faith at death, when we face, which all of us will, when faith, when you're going to die, is it knowing that he promised and that he's faithful, and he who promised is faithful. If we can die with that is the faith that we need. And Romans 8:28 is a great resting place for a Christian where it didn't work out the way you had planned. This is comfort even in bad times. God's working out his program, which is all centered on his infinite love for us. May not look like it at all times. Then you add, of course, Romans 8:28 is he works all things after, or excuse me, Romans 8:28 is, and we know that all things work together for the good to them that love God and them that are called according to his purpose. And Ephesians 1:11 is he works all things after the counsel of his will. All things after the counsel of his will. And 2 Chronicles 16:9. I haven't quoted that in a while, but it's one of my favorites. The eyes of the Lord look to and fro throughout the earth, looking to show himself strong to them whose heart is loyal to him. You're just looking for somebody with an inkling of faith in him out there to show himself strong. 2 Chronicles 16:9. That's how we have rest, is that kind of faith. That's what these examples are. Verse 13, these all died in faith, having not received the promises in their lifetime, but as they're realizing, oh, it's not going to happen in my, what we call lifetime, right? It's going to happen after I die, and I'm going to be able to see it and realize it, because God is going to raise me from the dead also. He who promised is faithful to deliver. So that verse 13, just to dust up on that before we move on. Temporary residence, verse 13 says, and exiles on the earth. You know, we're just strangers here for a short time. And the Bible tells us we're not to be too friendly with this world, because it wasn't very friendly. It's not very friendly with us, and it wasn't very friendly with our Lord and Savior. They crucified him. But while we're here, we're to reflect his love on a lost and dying world. Anyway, so now let's pick it. We're up there, verse 14. So into context, these all died, not seeing the promise, but they had faith. And now verse 14, for those who say such thing as these did, declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And this is not it, right? This is not it. But verse 15, and truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had an opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. We looked at that last week, where the promise that and Jesus assured us of that. Or did we look at that? No, we didn't. But let me read it now. John 14, 1-3 says, Jesus says this, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. That's the great hope of when we die. Where he is, there we will be also. He's preparing a place for us. Just like it says in our text here, we desire a homeland in verse 14, and then in verse 16, we desire a better, that is a heavenly country. He has prepared a city for us. And it's not going to be like these cities we got down here. But he who promised all these things is faithful. We keep looking back to chapter 10, verse 23. He who promised is faithful. Great place to just set your mind on that. He who promised is faithful, and he works all things after the counsel of his will. So look at this, verse 13. If these wilderness, well, I should say the wilderness Hebrews did look back fondly on their bondage, remember? They looked back and said, oh, if we could just go be back in Egypt. And they didn't conclude that what God was doing had already done for them, and what he was going to do for them was better. Instead, they wanted to go back to Egypt, remember? So instead, we have here in this chapter, we have examples that did conclude that he who promised is faithful. They all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them. Verse 13. But look at this. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. This statement makes me wonder how many are out there that claim him as their God, that he is ashamed to be called such. It's not because of their sin. It's not because of their disobedience or anything like that that makes them ashamed. It's their unbelief, their lack of belief that he is faithful, what he promised he will do, and that however things work out, that's okay because they have faith, because we have faith. It's to deny his power, that like those ancient Hebrews did. It's unbelief. You see, those giants were too big to go into the land. They didn't have faith because they supposed their God to be a little God that couldn't deliver them. These he's ashamed to be called their. Those who pray without faith, that he even hears them, but they go through the motions anyway and they pray anyway. He's ashamed of that. Those that deny his word, what he said, who he says he is and what he said he did, from starting with the first 5 words of the Bible. In the beginning, God created. Those who deny the virgin birth and the other miracles, like they prefer to believe that Jesus walked on a sandbar instead of we walked on the water. Those who believe in naturalistic explanations for every miracle in the Bible and try to, the Red Sea crossing and things like this. They deny the global flood. They call it a local flood, all this kind of stuff. What they're denying is the supernatural. They're denying that the phenomenal cosmic power of God, his omnipotence, cosmic being infinitely vast, right? That's what cosmic means. This is what they reject, his infinite power. I think that when they deny that and they limit God in any particular way, then he's ashamed to be called their God. So what is it in verse 16 that makes him not ashamed? Again, is it their obedience, their righteousness, their sacrifices? No, no, and no. It's their faith in him, that he is who he says he is, and that he'll perform exactly as he has stated. So the point here, I guess, if we believe that God is in any way limited, and his love isn't limited, in his power, his knowledge, his mercy, in any way that he's unable to keep the promises that he made, then I'm afraid he's ashamed to be called your God. Thankfully, we don't have that problem. But so let's keep moving on. These examples, this faith of these patriarchs, we're going to move on to verse 17. Now, Abraham and all the other examples that we saw, they, excuse me, they all understood by faith that God has plenty of time to work out his perfect will and his promises. And even if they don't happen in our lifetime, his promises will be performed, much like we saw with Abraham that said there. But now let's look at another example of Abraham and his faith. In verse 17, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. Now, we just saw that Abraham pretty much was dead, as we saw in the previous verses, old, when God promised that he would have a son from Sarah and with Sarah, and she was over 90. And that's what it's saying there, which even from the dead, from which he was also received in a figurative sense. That is Isaac. He got Isaac that way. So Abraham was tested and he passed. And remember that story? He went to offer Isaac, and God provided a ram and said, no, you're not offering him up. But let's just turn to Genesis 17:15 and look at that. You don't. I'm going to read it. You don't have to turn there, but if you want to, this is Genesis 16, starting at verse 15. Then God said to Abraham, for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. So this is where God changes their names from Abram to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah. And then in verse 16, he says, and I will bless her and also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be the mother of nations. Kings of people shall be from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, shall a child be born of a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, now this he says aloud, that he all said in his heart. He says to God out loud, he says, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Then God said, no, that's not where your seed is. That's not going to be whom I'm going to bless you with. Your idea, your plan is that the blessing should go through Ishmael. But God said, no, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and I'll make him fruitful and multiply him exceedingly. And he shall beget 12 princes, and I'll make him a great nation. But, verse 21, my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this set time next year. Now, God has to say it several times to Abraham, but he gets he gets it and finally says, oh, God's serious about this. I'm actually really going to have a son by Sarah. And then fast forward some 15 years or so, God says, oh, go sacrifice Isaac. And during what must have been an agonizing 3-day journey to the same hill called Calvary, Abraham took his son, this miracle child, and he had time to think it through on the way there. You see, if God could give him Isaac, although Abraham's womb was, she was past menopause, past the ability to have children. He was past the age to produce children. And if he could